So we just did exercise 2, which is going to be followed by exercise 2, which I will correct in a bit. Like I said, I'm not incredible at PowerPoint. Great. So exercise 2, we were the sensor. We took data from a control into an indicator. Easy stuff, right? This is what the code should have ended up looking like. Right here. Right? Now when I hit the run button, 5 goes across, and we're all very happy. Now, one of the things that was brought up that's an editing trick is that essentially as you move around on the front panel or the block diagram, LabVIEW is trying to guess what you're trying to do. So notice, when I'm right over the top of this wire, I get the arrow. See that cursor becomes an arrow? When the cursor's an arrow, I can select things. So I selected that, and now I can move it. But when my cursor is right near a wire, 2 pixels below it or 2 pixels above it, look at what I get. I get the wiring tool. So now I can wire. Now people with bifocals usually have a lot of trouble with this because you're basically trying to get into a couple pixel space for the cursor to change. When you're over the triangle, you get the wiring tool. When you're over the middle of the my height, you get an arrow. When it's the arrow, I can move things. So there's arrows and wiring, and we'll continue to talk about, oh, and of course, when I float over the top of words, I get what's called the text editing tool as soon as I double click. So all of that is happening because we're trying to auto-detect what tool you need to use. All right? I would talk about turning that off, but never turn it off. It's always going to be on. All right? But it does mean that you have to get used to figuring out how to change things, or how to move the cursor to the right spot to get something to move. So for instance, if I wanted to move the my height control and I'm floating over a letter, what's my cursor look like? Doesn't look like the arrow. Doesn't look like the wiring tool. It looks like the text editing tool. So if I click and try to move that thing, it doesn't move. The only thing I can do from that location is change the text. If I want to move this, I need to get the arrow to come up. So notice when I'm right on the border of it, the arrow comes up. Now when I click on it, I can move it. Does that make sense? You'll just get used to that over time, but it's good to know that it's out there up front. A really great trick that works all the time to move something is just to click and drag an area around it, and then it's selected. And once it's selected, I always get the arrow when I want to move something. Does that make sense? And you can select multiple things by hitting Shift or Control. All the normal Windows things apply. Okay, great. Now, in exercise 2 again, which we're now going to call exercise 3, we're going to add to this, we're going to make this into, actually, am I recording right now? I think I am. Yeah. We're going to make this into an aiming tool. So we're going to figure out if a height is too high. So that's the problem statement. If the height is too high, we're going to, so we need to add a function that figures out if our height that we input on the front panel on the control is greater than 7. Height has an E in it, there we go, is over 7. Okay, so there are 2 things that we're going to need on the block diagram, and 1 new thing that we're going to need on the front panel. The other part of my problem statement is I want to light up the light bulb on the front panel if the number that I input is too high. So that's the second part of the problem statement. Does that make sense? And then we'll give you the instructions afterwards. So watch me do it once, don't do it along with me, and try to do it again in just a second. On the front panel, I now need a light bulb. So what do? I right click. Where are light bulbs? There looks like a little light bulb area, so you could look for the picture that looks like a light bulb, or you could realize that light bulbs can either be on or off. They can be true or false. Those are called Booleans. Why are they called Booleans? Do you know? Yeah. Okay, there was a question that maybe bool was something about up and down. It turns out there was a guy named William Boole who figured out how to deal with trues and falses and, make a lot of logic happen. So we call these things Booleans. Fun. So we go to a Boolean and we grab a round LED or a square LED. It really doesn't matter. That's a light emitting diode. And when I drop one of these things, I can change its shape. Notice there are resizing handles here, so I can make it look like this, or I can make it look like that. Whatever I want it to look like. And this is a light bulb, so notice when I float over the middle of it, I get this new, I get a new cursor. It's not the arrow, it's not the wiring tool, it's not the text input, it's the finger. And the finger is the chooser. So it allows you to choose the value. So if you want to change the value of something, you can give it the finger. Don't tell anybody I told you that. Okay, great. So notice when the finger's up, I can't move it. So what do I have to do? I have to find that spot where my arrow is if I want to move this around. If I want to resize it, of course, there are blue resizing handles, and that allows me to resize the button. I can double click on the text and change this, so I'm going to call this too high, ? So your first step in making the new program is going to be to drop a Boolean on the front panel and name it appropriately. On the block diagram, you're going to need to do two things. Actually, three things, but we already know how to do one of them. You're going to have to drop a function that figures out if one thing is greater than another. You're going to have to drop the number that you're going to be greater than. And you're going to have to hook all of that up to the light bulb. The wiring you already know how to do. So how do you find new functions on the block diagram? You right-click. She is now the secretary of right-clicking. That is terrific. So when you right-click on the block diagram, notice you get a bunch of functions that you can drop. And there are lots of functions that are about comparing things and structures and arrays and clusters and numbers. So I'm just going to tell you that if you are comparing two objects, two numbers, see if one is greater than the other, that's probably under comparisons. And the function that you're looking for is called greater ? Greater ? There are other functions that do greater. That's greater than or less or equal to. There's greater than 0. It's none of those functions. It's just the greater than function. Click and drop. You click to pick something up. You click to drop it. When you drop it, you can use that Control H help option to figure out what the thing does. This is context help. Or if I really needed a lot of help, I could right-click on the thing and go to help. And this brings up eye-watering, mind-numbing help. I mean, this tells you what all the data types are. So if you're an adult and you like to know everything about everything, this is the place for you. But sometimes you don't need that much help, all right? Sometimes you just need a little context help, and that's what we've done here. We've got the context help up. Notice that this function has how many inputs and how many outputs? 2 inputs, 1 output. So I can say if this, my height, is greater than a number, then I get an output. Now, how do I add a number? I right-click. So in my problem statement, I could add a number. I could add another control to the front panel, right? I could do that, and then you could input what the measured item is and then also what your comparison is. But what I've decided is that for my robot, 7 is always too high. If you go over 7, it is always too high. 7 is constantly too high, which means I want a number that doesn't change. I want a number that is constant. So I'm going to look for a numeric constant. Now, if I didn't know where those were, I can always right-click and search. Now, when you hit the search button, it's going to build a word list for you. And so if I'm looking for things that are constant, I get a constant set. So you can see there are tab constants and path. This is another place where I have to do item number 2 in my favorite things to do in LabVIEW, which is read. You got to read. And I can read all the way down. Oh, and look, there's a numeric constant. So there's a constant that's numeric. And I found it. So now I can type in numeric constant, and there it is. Now watch real close. This really gets people with bifocals, so watch very close. Once you've got this thing in the list, you can double click on it and it will show you where the item was in the pallets. Watch. Double click. Boom. It zooms right in on where it was in the pallet. You want me to see that again? Yeah, you do. Search. Double click. Watch real close. And boom, there it is. So it shows you where it was in the pallet, or you can go back to search and you can just pull this thing over into the pallet by clicking and dragging. Does that make sense? Great. So this is now a numeric constant, and I'm going to type in the number 7. How do I do that? Double click, start typing, because I got that smart tool on. Now I've got to wire everything up to everything else. Click, click. So notice I could go backwards. This has got a terminal. If I float over the top of it, it's got a little orange circle and a wire going into it. I click. I can change the direction of the wire. I can right click and clean it up. I can click this output terminal. Notice it's got a green circle. Green, by the way, means Boolean. So this is carrying a number. This is carrying a number. This is actually carrying a true or a false, which is a Boolean value, and you can see that because green things have T and F on them. Okay? So you should be able to now modify your code so that you add a function and a constant, and you can make your code work like this code. And I'm going to actually use the window tile left and right. My boss told me never to demonstrate like this because it's a little confusing. But that's your front panel and your block diagram together. Everybody good? Let's come back and stop the recording, and I'll let you work on that for a second.